want to welcome you here to Mission Community Church. Glad that you decided to be with us as we worship together and hear from God's Word. So whether you are a regular attender, perhaps you're visiting for the first time today, or you're tuning in online, welcome. I hope that you've been warmly welcomed, and I hope that you leave here encouraged and challenged wherever you are in your journey. Over the last couple of weeks now, we're in a new sermon series that I've entitled The Crazy Cycle. And it's a series that deals specifically with marriage as we look at the culture around us. Depending on the statistics that you read, there are marriages that are failing all around. Maybe that's even in some of our own cases that we find ourselves struggling in our marriage relationships. And so the hope in this series is to really, I guess, a couple of things. One, to prepare those who are not yet married so that when you get into marriage 5, 10, 15 years down the road, you don't look back on the beginning of your marriage and say, if only I would have known then what I know now. But then to also help protect those current marriages, to strengthen them and encourage them and to challenge them to be all that you can be in your marriage. Because I believe that as we center our lives on Jesus, specifically as we center our marriages on Jesus, that our marriage is going to be everything that we want it to be. And that through our marriage, Jesus is going to make us everything that he wants us to be. Now, here's a little bit of a disclaimer. Anybody can get married. It takes hard work to build a good marriage. Anybody can get married, but it takes hard work to build a good marriage. And so I want to start off just by opening with this question. How many of you have ever done something crazy, ridiculous, silly, maybe foolish, all in the name of love? Anybody? Come on, put those hands up. You got some of this out there. I can remember the first day that I laid my eyes on Colleen. I've shared this story before. I was a junior in high school. I'm standing up at the upper part of our playground of my school campus, and here comes this bombshell of a blonde walking in and into our school. We were having an open house. And from that day forward, I knew that I had to do whatever I could to win the attention and the affection of this young gal. And so when I was a senior, we started dating. And one of the things that I would do to try to continue to win the attention, the affection of this bombshell blonde was to wash her car. I would take her car and I would go get it detailed. Now, that doesn't maybe necessarily seem like a big deal unless you're caught driving around town in this. A 1991 yellow Volkswagen Cabriolet. I was a senior in high school. Not only that, she had her car decked out in cow-printed seat covers, leopard-printed seatbelt covers, and 2 hot pink dice dangling from the rearview mirror. It was completely emasculating to me as a senior in high school. But the things that we would do for love. I remember when Colleen and I first got married, about a year into marriage, she's already talking about having kids. Like, good night, let's just get focused on our careers. And so I went and did the next logical thing. I went and got my beautiful bride a dog, Buddy. Buddy was a handful. My mother-in-law would always say that Buddy was nobody's buddy. Buddy was like Marley and me on steroids. And so in my way to try to, again, to maintain her attention and her affection and try to get her mind off of kids, I went and got her a dog. And then one day I come home after work. She's in the backyard. And she yells from the backyard, "Jason, come back here." And I hear 2 dogs barking in the backyard. And I walk to my backyard, and here's Oscar, a second dog that she had just decided to show up with. And so I continue to try to win the attention and the affection of my beautiful bombshell blonde. I can remember even when Colleen and I were engaged to be married, well, actually prior to being engaged, between 2001 and 2004, the whole scrapbooking industry doubled in revenue. A lot of times, or with the help of of companies like Keeping Memories Alive and Creative Memories. And I remember in my family particularly, all the women, my mom, my sister, my cousins, aunts, they got into this creative memories kick. And so I started for weeks and weeks and weeks starting to put together a scrapbook of Colleen's and my history. Going all the way back to the beginning when we first started dating and cutting out all this construction paper stuff and doing all this, again, emasculating things to win the attention, the affection of my bride. And then there were some pictures of her mom and I meeting for lunch, and then there were pictures of her dad and I meeting for lunch, and as she continued to go through pictures, there were these rings that showed up in these pictures until she got to the back of this scrapbook, and there was an actual engagement ring waiting for her. The things that we would do to capture the attention and the affection of our brides. We all have stories like that. At least I would hope we would all have stories like that, where we do some foolish, silly, ridiculous, crazy things, some more crazier than others, to win the attention and the affection of that person that we have our eye on. And perhaps that's true of you today and has been true of you in the past, but what happens when you're 5, 10, 15 years into your marriage and you wake up and that passion's gone? That affection is gone, that pursuit over your spouse is gone. Think about this. In what area of your life can you be lazy and see improvement? So when it comes to your career, can you be lazy in your career? Can you be successful in your career and just sit back and do nothing? When it comes to your physical health, can you just sit back and be lazy when it comes to your physical health and expect to get six-pack abs and jacked shoulders? Or when it comes to really any area of your life, you can't be lazy and expect improvement. Yet when we get into our marriages, 5, 10, 15 years into our marriages, we sometimes take a back seat, we sit back, relax, we get lazy, and we wonder why our marriages are struggling. We wonder why our marriages are failing. Again, anybody can get married, but it takes hard work to build a good marriage. Last week, we looked at this principle of priorities in our marriages. That as we enter into the marriage covenant, that God is always number one and our spouse is always number two. Jesus says it this way, that you should love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, with all of your strength. And then the second commandment is like it, to love your neighbor as yourself. So even in general terms, Jesus says God is always number one, and then people come in at number two. But then we looked at that shift, that as we grow up within the family unit, that generally speaking, and again, this is going to be different for people, but generally speaking, as we're growing up within the family, God is number one and our parents are number two. But then when we identify a spouse and we leave our family and begin to cling to our spouse, in that moment, God is still number one, but then our spouse takes the number two. So it's this idea of priorities, that God is always number one and our spouse is always number two. This week, we're going to look at the principle of pursuit. And it's this idea that we continue to win the attention and the affection of our spouse, whether you're not yet married and you're just trying to initially capture that attention or affection, or whether you're 5, 10, 15, 30, 50 years into your marriage, we continue to pursue our spouses. The overarching principle for this week is this: always pursue your number two. So if the first week is God is always number one and your spouse is always number two, then this week's main idea is always pursue your number two. So let's unpack this whole principle. There's, I think, one of the best examples of this in the Bible when it comes to just relational pursuit is the story of Jacob and Rachel in the Bible. If you're familiar with the story of Jacob and Rachel, Jacob was brother with Esau, and there was that whole birthright issue that happened, that Jacob came in and stole the birthright from Esau, and so Esau got pretty ticked at him and basically ran Jacob out of town. So Jacob is running for a desert land to where he knows his uncle is. And so we pick up the story in Genesis chapter 29. And in Genesis chapter 29, it says this: Then Jacob went on his journey, and he came to the land of the people of the east. As he looked, he saw a well in the field, and behold, 3 flocks of sheep lying beside it. For out of that well of the flocks were watered. The stone on the well's mouth was large, and when all the flocks gathered there, the shepherds would roll the stone from the mouth of the well and water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place over the mouth of this well. Now you have to understand the context of what's happening here. So this is all happening in like a Middle Eastern type of a setting, where there's dry lands and there's deserts. And so the winds would come and take these desert sands and blow them all over the place. And because of how dry it was in this climate, the water would just evaporate quickly. And so you would have this well, this big cistern of water, and covering this well would be this large stone to protect it from the winds and the sand and the evaporation. But this thing was typically so large that it would take several people to move it, usually 2 to 3 guys. And so you would have these shepherds and their flocks come to this place and together remove this stone so that their flocks could drink. Jacob stumbles upon this well and notices that flocks are gathering there. And so he starts to talk to the shepherds there in this area. And he's starting to ask about, hey, are you familiar with my uncle, Laban? Yeah, I believe he has some flocks of sheep in this area of town. And so he picks it up. We pick it up in verse 9 of chapter 29. He says, while he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. Now, as soon as Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob came near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. This is what I kind of imagine in this scenario. Again, this large stone taking about 2 to 3 guys to move. Jacob sees this bombshell blonde walking with her sheep. Ooh, I'm gonna move this stone. And so in a feat of strength, he starts to flex a little bit and puts himself in a position where he knows that she's watching and moves this stone so that the sheep can be watered. For the next month, Jacob begins working for his uncle, caring for the sheep. And at one point in the conversation, his uncle Laban comes to Jacob and says, hey, you've been working for me now. How can I repay you? Let me pay you something. So Jacob, he's thinking for a moment. And he says this in Genesis chapter 29, verses 16 through 17. You have 2 daughters, Laban, my uncle. The name of the older was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were weak, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. I love how the Bible kind of describes this, that Leah's eyes were weak. In other words, in the Hebrew, she had a really good personality. Rachel was this bombshell. Leah's eyes were, glasses. Her eyes were weak. Jacob had his attention on Rachel and did everything that he could to start winning her attention, start winning her affection. And so after a month of work, he's thinking, okay, I noticed that you have these 2 daughters, Rachel and Leah. What do you think about giving me your daughter, Rachel, in marriage? And so the text says in Genesis chapter 29, verse 18, Jacob loved Rachel. And he said to Laban, I will serve you 7 years for your younger daughter, Rachel. And all the women went, he's working for me. 7 years. Laban says, fair enough. Work for me 7 years and you can have my daughter, Rachel. Now the imagery is beautiful that starts to happen here. He starts working hard for Rachel, and even when Jacob is working for her, he says that these 7 years were but a few days because of how much he loved Rachel. Now this is where the story gets a little weird. Laban, the father, pulls a little rope-a-dope a little switcheroo on Jacob. And so in those days when the wedding ceremony occurred, the women were typically completely covered from head to toe, little slits that they could actually see out of. And so Laban actually marries his older daughter Leah to Jacob. Jacob wakes up the next morning after the wedding tent experience. Says, "Whoa, what? You're not Rachel." Actually is pretty ticked and goes to Laban and says, "Hey, what are you doing?" Laban says, well, in our culture, it's customary to marry off the older daughter first, and so here's Leah. Now, what happens in the story next, sometimes people get a little bit confused. What Jacob says is, no, I've worked for your daughter Rachel, and so Laban actually gives Rachel to Jacob and says, hey, you still owe me 7 years of labor. Jacob agrees. And so as he already has Rachel, he is working for another 7 years. And here's the whole idea of that story, that he continued to work for, he continued to pursue, he continued to chase after Rachel, even after he already had her. I believe this is what God wants for our marriages. That he doesn't want us just to initially capture the attention, the affection of our spouses prior to marriage, but that even in our marriage, we are continuing to pursue one another, that we're continuing to fight and follow and try to get the attention and the affection of our spouses. Because again, we are always to pursue our number two, even after you already have him or have her. You know, for those who may be dating, for those who are maybe in a serious relationship and you're maybe even talking about marriage, here's just a word of warning or encouragement that if there's no mutual pursuit there, then I would question the intent of that relationship. That girls, you are worth pursuing. That you should have that guy chase you. And if you're doing stuff that doesn't cause him to chase you, then I would question that as well. That if you're just giving yourself to him right off the bat and he doesn't have to work for your attention or your affection, that you are in a very dangerous place. And guys, that we are to be pursuing that person that God has for us as we continue to try to win the attention and the affection of that individual. And so if you're in that relationship, that dating relationship, and there's not that mutual pursuit, I would question the intent there. But then for those of us who are married, what are we doing to continue to chase after our spouse, to continue to hold on to the attention and the affection of our spouse? And so this is where I want to get into just some practicalities of what does that look like? What does that look like when you're 5, 10, 15, 40 years into marriage? How do we continue to pursue our spouse? Because I don't think people enter into marriage hoping that it's going to fail. I'm pretty confident to say that I doubt anybody would enter into marriage expecting to eventually split everything in half and see your kids every other weekend. I don't think anybody has that intention going into marriage. But when we get lazy, things start to grab our attention and take us away from our spouse. Our priorities get all out of whack and our pursuit of our spouses stop. And so what are some practical things that we can do to continue to pursue after our spouse in order that we center our lives on Jesus so that our marriages are everything that we hope it to be, and that through our marriages he makes us everything into who he wants us to be? The first is this. If you think of something good, say it. If you think of something good about your spouse, say it. The writer of Thessalonians, Paul, 1 Thessalonians 5:11 says this, therefore encourage one another and build one another up just as you are doing. We are constantly to be edifying, to building up our spouses. I try to do this with Colleen a lot. That when I notice her do things, particularly in her giftings and her passions, I just try to build that up in her. Wow, babe, you're an amazing leader when it comes to leading this group of women. Babe, you make the most amazing chocolate chip cookies. I kid you not. That you try to find those areas in your spouse's life where they excel and you just build that up. If you think of something good, say it. Now for guys, this is maybe let me hone in on this a little bit more. Typically for husbands, you want to pursue your number two with words of affection. Pursue your number two with words of affection. Let me give you a warning. Don't pursue your number two with sexual words of affection. You want to pursue her with non-sexual words of affection. Husbands, pursue your spouse with non-sexual words of affection. Let me say that again. With words that are non-sexual. Some of these guys are like, I don't even know what that means. Pursue your spouse with words of affection. One easy way to do this is just simply by saying, I love you because fill in the blank. I love you because, Colleen, you're an amazing mother to our children. I love you because, Colleen, you bring out the best in me. I love you because you make the best chocolate chip cookies. I love you because this and that. I love you because. Pursue her with words of affection because, generally speaking, women want to know, do you love me today? Let me talk to the wives for a moment. Wives, you ought to pursue your spouse with words of affirmation. Words of affirmation. Here's why this is so important. You girls have the power to resurrect and crucify your spouse. Your words have so much power over us as your husbands. That even for me, as Colleen's husband, that people can come and attack my character. They could say what they don't like about me, and I can brush that off pretty easily, and I'm going to sleep pretty good at night. But if Colleen says something that points out something in me, or she has the power to resurrect me or to crucify me. And with that same thought that if she is behind me and she is giving me words of affirmation in whatever path God is calling me, I will go charge that mountain because I know that she is behind me. So wives, pursue your number two with words of affirmation because generally speaking, men want to know this. Do you believe in me today? Women want to know, again, generally speaking, do you love me today? Men want to know, do you believe in me today? There's a great study, a Bible group or a small group study called Love and Respect. And if you haven't gone through that study by Dr. Emerson, I would encourage you to do so. It talks about this whole idea of how we as husbands ought to unconditionally love our wives and how they are wired to want to feel unconditional love, and that we as husbands are wanting to be respected and believed in, and that's what we're looking for. And so that's maybe a tool that you can explore on your own. And so the first principle is simply this: if you think of something good, say it. The second practicality, the second practice in pursuing our spouses is this: if you think of something special, do it. If you think of something special, do it. James actually says it this way: so whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. That if we recognize something good and don't do that thing, it's actually sin to us that withholds that from someone. And so if you think of something special, do it. Guys, this isn't that difficult at the end of the day. I am told, and I've been affirmed by Colleen, that especially if you're in a situation where you have kids, if you would just once in a while give those little snot-nosed devils a bath, that would set your wife up with so much just comfort and respect. That they know that they are special to you because you are taking care of this just seemingly insignificant thing. That generally speaking, when it comes to doing something special, women want to know, are you thinking of me today? So one of the things that I try to do with Colleen is especially in this time of year, if ever I'm at Starbucks, which is my mobile office, I'm there quite a bit, is to bring her home just a pumpkin spice latte. Nothing real big and extravagant, but it's doing something special to let her know that, hey, I am thinking of you today. I am still wanting your attention and your affection. And so if you think of something special, simply do it. The third practice would be this. If you want something different, be it. If you want something different, be it. If you're not getting what you want out of your marriage, ask the question, what are you giving? That if you're not getting from your marriage what you hoped you would get, then I would then turn the question back on you and say, what are you giving to your marriage? If you want something different, you need to be it. At the end of the day, we are all held accountable for how we treat our spouse. When Colleen and I were getting married, we were living in North Carolina, and I remember our mentor couple, George and Sally Ross. They were such a great influence in preparing us for marriage. And I remember one particular night that Sally went and met with Colleen on one side of the restaurant, and I went and talked with George on the other side of the restaurant. And one of the things that George said to me, it's really the only thing I actually remember from this whole mentoring relationship, is that he said, Jason, at the end of the day, you're not going to be held responsible for how Colleen treats you. You're going to be held responsible for how you serve and love Colleen, whether she returns that affection or not. At the end of the day, you are going to be held responsible for how you love and serve your spouse. And so George and Sally Ross implanted this in our minds as we entered into our marriage relationship, where even to this day, 11 years later, I keep thinking of George. Jason, it doesn't matter what she does. How are you loving and serving her? Don't complain about what your marriage is not. Don't complain about what your spouse is not. If you're not getting what you want out of your marriage, then I would ask the question, what are you giving? If you want something different, be it. Because it is impossible to criticize your way into a better marriage. It doesn't even have to be marriage. It can be any human relationship. It can be sibling relationships, parent relationships, just friendships, church relationships. You cannot criticize your way into better relationships. So if you think of something special, do it. If you think of something special, say it. If you think of, let me start over. If you think of something good, say it. If you think of something special, do it. And if you want something different, be it. Now, to bring this message full circle, I'm going to ask Colleen to bring her perspective on just this whole topic of pursuit. And what does it look like for her as my wife to try to win the attention and the affection of me?
Oh, I forgot my microphone. Is this on? Oh, there we go. All right, ladies. What does it look like for us to pursue our men? The first thing is we need to pay attention. That was the first thing I wanted us to kind of think of, is we need to pay attention to our husbands. One of the coolest gifts that God gives us as wives is we get to know our husbands in such a neat, intimate way that other relationships, you don't get to know them this way. I know him in a different way than his parents know him, than his friends know him, than his coworkers know him. I have a front row seat into Jason's life. I know what makes him upset. I know what makes him feel loved. We need to pay attention to those things that God puts right in front of us about our spouses. This is probably newsflash, but our husbands are not the men that we married for us 12 years ago. I laugh. I was thinking about this when I said I do to Jason. he thought he was going to be a pharmacist. And here we are today, and he is a pastor. Things are different. Life is different. We didn't have kids. Our Saturdays looked different. We would go out on the back of his motorcycle and ride through the country. Now our Saturdays look like we get in a van and go to different sports fields and watch our kids play games. So my question for each of you is, how well do you know your spouse? Are you remembering them to who they were however many years ago? Are you in tune to their needs now? Do you sit down and do you ask, hey, what are your dreams, babe? What do you want the next year to look like? What do you want the next 5 years to look like? What can I do to serve you today? It looks different than it maybe even looked last week. So those are some important things to just consider and ask yourself. Third, and this was huge for us, is we need to carve out time to be alone with our spouse. Jason and I just honestly went through a season where the kids would go to bed. We would be sitting next to each other on the couch, but I'd have my phone scrolling through social media. He'd have his laptop and the game on. And when one of us tried to start a conversation, we would get annoyed because the other person was half listening. So I would say, stop texting, stop tweeting, stop using electronic devices, and carve out that time to be alone with your spouse. One thing, really simple thing that we have done, I would say that really is life-changing to our relationship, is we all kind of ask that typical question of, how was your day? Good. How was your day? Bad, whatever. And it's left at that. Somebody gave us a tool of 3 questions to ask each other. One was, how did you feel most fulfilled today? So it really makes you think. I get to hear wow, what happened in Jason's day today that really was filling for him, that filled his cup? Second was, what was the most frustrating thing that happened to you today? And then that opens the door for him to be able to share maybe some really frustrating things that happened, and for me to just be a listening ear. And then lastly is, how did you feel most loved today? So you get to hear all kind of the different interactions from his day that build him up, frustrated, ways that he felt loved. So I challenge you with that today. Invest in your spouse. Get to know who they are. Get to know their dreams, desires, frustrations, and use those questions as a tool.
Thanks, babe. Appreciate it. We can give Colleen a round of applause. Colleen does a great job with just pursuing me and like those questions. She loves asking those questions. And sometimes I'm a little bit easier in answering those questions, and sometimes I'm just frustrated. I don't want to answer those questions, but she's pursuing me. She really wants to know what's making me tick and what's motivating me and what's giving me the strength and the encouragement that I need to be a better husband, a better father. Like I said, she also makes the best chocolate chip cookies. And kissing's just as good as chocolate chip cookies. So what is that thing, spouse, that you can do to pursue your wife? What is that thing that you can do to pursue your husband? And maybe you're not married here today, and there's probably a good number of you that aren't married here today. What is that thing that you can just continue to pursue in that whatever relationship, that parental relationship, that friendship, that maybe it is a dating relationship or a more serious, committed engagement type of relationship? What can you do today to continue to just pursue after that relationship, to win the attention and the affection of that person? Guys, there was a time when we did some pretty silly things for our wives, to win them over, to win their attention and affection. And if there's something that I want to encourage you with today, if you're not getting what you want out of your marriage, then take, again, a hard look at what you're giving, and you must be willing to do what you've never done in order to get what you've never had. But even a lot of times as we look back on what our relationships used to be, especially like in that whole engagement, early marriage type of relationships, and maybe it's not that way today, then I would say this to you, that you must be willing to do what you once did to have what you once had. So what is it that can win the attention and the affection of your spouse? How can you continue to always pursue your number two? Because again, at the end of the day, as we center our marriage on Jesus, that I believe he is calling us to do this as spouses. As we center our marriage on Jesus, our marriage is going to be everything that we want it to be. And through our marriage, he is going to make us everything that he wants us to be. So rule number one, God is always your number one. Your spouse is always your number two. And then rule number two, always pursue your number two. Say kind things, do kind things. And then if you want something different, you gotta look at your own life and see what you're giving to your marriage and be that thing. So Father, would you help us to grow in this area of our relationships? Would you help us to grow as individuals in marriages? Even for those that are going down that path in marriage, would you help prepare them for this relationship? Would you help protect those who are already married, so that as we continue to love one another, we are preaching a gospel to a lost and dying world through our marriages. And so your richest blessing upon each and every marriage here, your richest blessing upon each and every relationship here, may they all bring glory to you for the good of each other. In Jesus' name, amen.